The date is May 1st, 2026. Exactly 30 days ago, the global media landscape didn't just shift, it experienced a tectonic rupture. For over 100 years, the British monarchy has been defined by a single unbreakable law: never complain, never explain. These 4 words were more than a public relations strategy. They were the oxygen of the crown, the invisible shield that kept the institution hovering in a state of semi-divine mystique above the messy reality of human grievance. To speak was to become common. To explain was to admit weakness. But on the 1st of April, 2026, that shield was not just lowered, it was weaponized. Imagine the shockwaves that rippled through the world when Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, sat before a camera and did the unthinkable. She didn't just talk, she dismantled a decade of carefully curated narratives. For 27 years, Sophie has been the ultimate practitioner of the sacred silence. She entered the family as an outsider, weathered her own early storms with the tabloid machinery, and eventually emerged as the late Queen's most trusted confidant and the current King's secret weapon. She was the one who never stumbled, the one who never leaked, the one who understood that the crown is a vocation of service, not a platform for the ego. So, when the woman who has remained silent for nearly 3 decades chooses to speak, you don't just listen, you realize the world you knew has ended. This broadcast was not a desperate plea for sympathy or a celebrity tell-all. It was a calculated, sanctioned strike. It was the moment the monarchy stopped being the punching bag for the Montecito narrative and started being the prosecutor. The magnitude of this shift cannot be overstated. For years, we watched as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex released book after book, documentary after documentary, and interview after interview. Throughout it all, Buckingham Palace maintained an icy, almost frustrating neutrality. They responded with polite, one-sentence statements about recollections varying. But on that first day of April, the game of cat and mouse ended. Within just 4 hours of Sophie's testimony airing, the palace did something unprecedented. They didn't distance themselves. They didn't call it a private matter. They issued a formal validation that sent a chill through the diplomatic world. Their statement was simple. This represents the position of the institution. By using those 6 words, the Crown effectively administrativized the rejection of Harry and Meghan. They moved the conflict out of the realm of a messy family feud and into the domain of state security and institutional integrity. This was no longer about hurt feelings between brothers or a falling out between sisters-in-law. It was a declaration that the Sussexes were no longer viewed as family members in exile, but as an existential threat to the hierarchy of the United Kingdom. Sophie's voice served as the perfect vessel for this message. Unlike the central players who might be accused of bias, Sophie was the mentor. She was the woman specifically tasked by the late Queen Elizabeth II to be the bridge for Meghan Markle. She was the one who reached out, the one who offered the roadmap to royal life, and the one who was ultimately and systematically rebuffed. When Sophie speaks, she brings the weight of 30 years of loyalty and the clinical observation of a seasoned royal operative. The question everyone is asking on this 1st of May is, why now? Why break a century of tradition in 2026? The answer lies in the current American state visit. As King Charles and the Prince of Wales moved through the United States last month, the contrast was deafening. The palace realized that silence was no longer enough to protect the future of the monarchy. They needed to provide the public with the missing pieces of the puzzle, the documented reality of what happened behind the palace walls starting in 2017. Sophie's testimony focuses on what she calls the 7-year collection. She reveals that while the public saw a royal family trying to stay above the fray, the institution was actually in a state of high alert. They weren't just ignoring the drama, they were recording it. Every breach of protocol, every strategic probe, and every instance of what Sophie describes as theatrical intimacy was being filed away. The palace wasn't being weak. They were being patient. They were waiting for the moment when the Montecito illusion would begin to exhaust itself and the world would be ready for a different kind of truth. This broadcast has created an agonizing psychological tension for those who have followed this saga. It forces us to reconcile the image of the victimized Duchess of Sussex with the professional strategist Sophie describes a woman who, within 72 hours of arriving at Sandringham, was already calculating the power dynamics of the room rather than learning the traditions of the house. Sophie's account shatters the narrative of a woman struggling to adapt to a foreign culture and replaces it with the image of a calculated encroachment. As we dive deeper into this script, we are going to look at the specific incidents that Sophie revealed the mapping of the future king, the sabotage of the Royal Foundation Forum, and the moment Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was driven to tears just 20 minutes before a global broadcast. But before we get there, you have to understand the fundamental shift that occurred last month. The never-explained doctrine is dead. In its place is a new, more lethal strategy, the loud silence. The palace has proven that they don't need to engage in a back-and-forth media war. They only need to speak once, with total authority, and then allow the weight of the institution to do the rest. The Montecito chapter is being closed, not with a whimper, but with a clinical, documented execution of the facts. Sophie of Edinburgh has become the voice of 1,000 years of tradition, and as you are about to see, her revelation is only the beginning of the final collapse of the Sussex brand. Stay with us, because the details of the 72-hour probe are about to change everything you thought you knew about the winter of 2017. The fortress of silence has fallen, and what lies behind the walls is more explosive than any Netflix series could ever hope to be. To understand why the silence of the crown finally shattered in the spring of 2026, we must return to the winter of 2017. The public memory of that time is dominated by a single image: the Fab Four walking together towards Street, Mary Magdalene Church in Sandringham. It was presented to the world as a triumphant moment of modernization, a glamorous, biracial American actress joining the world's most traditional family. But according to Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, the reality inside the thick stone walls of the estate was far more clinical and ultimately far more chilling. Sophie reveals what she calls the 72-hour probe. This was the critical window of time between Meghan's arrival at Sandringham and the conclusion of the Christmas festivities. In most cases, a newcomer to the royal family spends their first 3 days in a state of overwhelmed reverence. They are taught how to curtsy, how to navigate the labyrinthine corridors, and how to master the subtle art of conversation with the late Queen. Sophie, who had been specifically tasked by Queen Elizabeth II to act as a mentor and a bridge for Meghan, arrived prepared to offer a roadmap for survival. She expected to find a woman eager to learn the unwritten rules of a 1,000-year-old institution. Instead, she found a woman who was already conducting a reconnaissance mission. In her testimony, Sophie describes a psychological atmosphere that was unlike anything she had experienced in her 27 years of royal life. While the other members of the family were focused on the traditions of the holiday, Sophie observed Meghan observing them. It wasn't the wide-eyed curiosity of a guest, it was the professional intensity of a strategist. Within the first 48 hours, Sophie realized that Meghan was not looking at the history on the walls or the weight of the vocation. She was mapping the influencers within the family tree. She was identifying the power dynamics, the vulnerabilities, and the hierarchies. The Duchess recounts a specific evening during that first Christmas where the senior royals were gathered for a private dinner. In the subtle language of the palace, every silence and every glance carries institutional weight. Sophie noticed Meghan's eyes moving across the room with a deliberate scanning motion. She wasn't seeking to integrate, she was seeking to categorize. Sophie shares a prophetic four-word warning she whispered to Prince Edward on their third night at Sandringham. She is already calculating. This was not a critique of a woman struggling to adapt to a foreign culture. It was the identification of a professional who viewed the monarchy not as a lifetime of service, but as a series of obstacles to be circumvented or leveraged. Sophie explains that in the royal family, power is not something you possess through a spouse. It is something you earn through a consistent and selfless surrender of the ego to the institution. However, Meghan's approach was the antithesis of this philosophy. One of the most explosive details in this chapter involves Sophie's attempt to offer Meghan a private mentorship session during those early days. Sophie reached out to explain the long game, the idea that personal ambition must be deferred in favor of the institution's enduring credibility. She wanted to warn Meghan that the British press and the British public do not fall in love with brands. They respect constancy. Meghan's reported response was a 5-word rebuttal that would eventually become the foundation of the entire conflict. I have Harry. That's all. To the outside world, that might sound like a statement of romantic devotion, but within the palace, it was a strategic declaration of war against the hierarchy. By stating she only needed Harry, Meghan was signaling her intent to bypass the collective structure of the crown. She was asserting that her proximity to the king's son rendered the traditional rules of service obsolete. Sophie describes this as the exact moment the internal alarm system of the palace was triggered. The establishment began to realize that they were not dealing with a newcomer who wanted to join the team, but with an individual who intended to create a competing power center using the prince as her primary asset. Sophie's account confirms that the senior royals, particularly the Prince of Wales, felt an immediate sense of unease. William's discomfort, which Sophie describes with surgical precision, was rooted in his lifelong training to detect people who seek to use the crown for personal elevation. He saw what Sophie saw, a strategic probe designed to test how far the institution would bend before it broke. This was the origin of the hardening of William's stance, not a reaction to a personality clash, but a sovereign need to protect the sanctity of the royal space from someone who viewed it as a ladder. The 72-hour probe set the tone for everything that followed. Sophie reveals that by the time the new year arrived in 2018, a detailed report had already been circulated among the senior staff. It didn't focus on Meghan's fashion or her American background. It focused on her behavioral patterns. The palace was no longer operating on hope. They had moved into a phase of clinical observation. For those of us watching from 2026, these revelations provide the missing context for the Megxit departure. It wasn't a sudden decision fueled by a harsh press. It was the inevitable conclusion of a process that began in the first 3 days at Sandringham. Sophie's testimony makes it clear the conflict was never about race, nationality, or modernity. It was about the fundamental clash between an institution that demands the death of the ego and an individual who sought to use that institution to build a global brand. But as we are about to see in the next part of this breakdown, the strategic probes were not limited to private dinner conversations. They soon moved into the public eye, manifesting as a tactic Sophie calls theatrical intimacy. And it was this tactic that would eventually drive a wedge between the two brothers that not even a decade could heal. Stay with us, because the details of the 2018 garden party and the mapping of Prince William are even more calculated than you can imagine. As we move into the third chapter of Sophie's extraordinary 2026 testimony, we transition from the private calculations of Sandringham to the public execution of what the Duchess calls theatrical intimacy. If the first 3 days were about mapping the internal power structures, the following years were about weaponizing those structures in front of a global audience. Sophie describes this period as a masterclass in psychological attrition, where the goal was not to join the royal family, but to rewrite its script with Meghan Markle as the sole protagonist. The Duchess of Edinburgh introduces a concept that has sent shockwaves through the diplomatic and social circles of London, the use of physical proximity as a strategic probe. In the world of the monarchy, space is sacred. Protocol dictates the distance between a senior royal and the public, and more importantly, the distance between family members of different ranks. Sophie reveals that Meghan identified these boundaries not as rules to be respected, but as vulnerabilities to be exploited. The first major example of this theatrical intimacy occurred during a garden party in May 2018, just days after the royal wedding. To the cameras, it looked like a warm interaction between a new bride and her brother-in-law. But Sophie, watching from a few paces away, saw a calculated encroachment. She recounts an incident where Meghan placed a hand flat on the back of Prince William while he was engaged in a conversation with a high-ranking diplomat. To a layperson, this might seem like a simple gesture of affection, but in the surgical language of royal protocol, a hand placed flat on the back of a future monarch is an act of possession and perceived equality that has not been earned. It is a gesture reserved for a spouse or a parent. Sophie confirms that by applying this gesture in a room filled with influencers, Meghan was attempting to manufacture a narrative of familiarity and influence for the benefit of the palace's internal surveillance. She wanted the staff, the courtiers, and the family to believe she had a level of intimacy with the heir to the throne that simply did not exist behind closed doors. Sophie describes William's reaction with clinical detail. He performed a professional redirection, a subtle shift in posture, and a physical repositioning taught to him from birth to ensure he is never used as a prop in another person's narrative. It was a silent reassertion of the boundary, but Sophie notes that the message from the Sussex camp was clear. We will push until you are forced to publicly push back. This psychological warfare reached its zenith during the Royal Foundation Forum in February 2019. This event was marketed as the debut of the Fab Four: William, Catherine, Harry, and Meghan, working as a unified charitable powerhouse. To the millions watching the live stream, it appeared to be a seamless demonstration of modern royalty. However, Sophie's 2026 revelation exposes the brutal reality of what she calls total war behind the curtain. Sophie reveals that the atmosphere within the building that morning was a state of administrative siege. The seating charts, the speaking order, and the pre-approved briefing notes, documents that had been meticulously negotiated for 4 months to maintain the political neutrality of the crown, were unilaterally discarded by the Sussex camp less than 60 minutes. before the four principals were scheduled to step onto the stage. The most damning detail of this chapter involves a scene of profound emotional distress in a private holding room just 20 minutes before the broadcast began. Sophie confirms for the first time that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, a woman whose entire public identity is built upon a foundation of impenetrable composure, was driven to tears. This was not a disagreement over a dress or a flower girl's tights. It was a deliberate and calculated confrontation initiated by Meghan regarding the foundation's mission. According to Sophie, Meghan insisted on introducing highly politicized and individualistic rhetoric into her speech rhetoric that had been explicitly vetoed by the Board of Trustees because it threatened the institution's neutrality. Meghan allegedly used the ticking clock as a weapon, knowing that the Prince and Princess of Wales were trapped. They could either concede to her changes and compromise the crown's integrity, or risk a public scene that would humiliate the monarchy on a global stage. Sophie describes this moment as the death of the family dynamic. It was the definitive proof for the senior royals that they were no longer dealing with a family member struggling with a new role. They were dealing with an active insurgent who viewed the institution's commitment to process as a weakness to be exploited. When Catherine walked onto that stage with a smile, she was performing an act of supreme professional discipline while reeling from what Sophie calls emotional attrition. Following the forum, the Prince of Wales allegedly reached a point of no return. Sophie reveals that William instructed his private secretary to begin a systematic separation of the households. The warmth that had once characterized the relationship between the brothers was replaced by a clinical adherence to protocol. This was not a reaction born of anger or petty jealousy, but of a sovereign need to protect the future king from a campaign of psychological and professional sabotage. Sophie's testimony in 2026 reframes the entire timeline of the Sussex departure. It suggests that the Megxit of 2020 was not a sudden escape from a hostile environment, but the conclusion of a failed attempt to stage an internal coup. Meghan's strategy of using theatrical intimacy to claim power had been met with a cold containment strategy from the palace. The Duchess of Edinburgh concludes this portion of her testimony by addressing the concept of the brand versus the vocation. She notes that during the 2019 period, she made one final attempt to intervene. She invited Meghan to Bagshot Park for tea, hoping to explain that in the royal family, you do not become an international brand, you become a national servant. Meghan's response, as reported by Sophie, was a dismissive assertion that Sophie's experience was irrelevant because she lacked a global platform. This distinction is the core of the entire conflict. Sophie's revelation proves that the palace knew, as early as 2019, that the Sussexes were building a separate, competing entity. Every disruption, every tear shed by Catherine, and every breach of protocol was being recorded and filed into what would eventually become the sovereign's archive. The institution was not being passive. It was being evidentiary. As we prepare to enter Part 4, we will look at how this conflict shifted from the interpersonal to the constitutional. We will explore the Lair Ruator, baptism, of Archie, and why Sophie characterizes it as a calculated veto against the sovereignty of the late Queen. The war was no longer just about who stood where in a garden party. It was about who controlled the future of the British state. Stay with us, because the administrativization of the rejection is about to get much more chilling. The shift from interpersonal friction to a full-scale constitutional crisis occurred in the summer of 2019, centered around an event that should have been a moment of unity, the baptism of Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor. In her 2026 testimony, Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, shatters the long-standing narrative that the secrecy surrounding this event was a simple plea for parental privacy. Instead, she characterizes it as the moment the crown realized the Sussexes were not just seeking a different lifestyle, but were attempting to hijack the sovereignty of royal ritual itself. To the public, the headlines of 2019 portrayed a couple struggling with the intrusive nature of the British press, but Sophie reveals a much darker internal reality. She describes the baptism as a calculated veto against the authority of the late Queen Elizabeth II. In the British monarchy, the introduction of a new member into the line of succession is not a private family affair. It is a matter of state. Protocole, tradition, and the unwritten constitution of the United Kingdom dictate that the public, who provide the very platform upon which the family stands, are entitled to certain historical markers. Sophie confirms that Meghan's refusal to release the names of the godparents and the banning of the royal press pool was a direct challenge to the Queen's sovereignty. It was an assertion that the Sussexes intended to utilize the titles, the security, and the global prestige of the monarchy, while unilaterally discarding the public obligations that justify their existence. Sophie recalls the atmosphere within the palace as one of cold disbelief. At 93 years old, the late queen had weathered decades of family turmoil, from the abdication to the fire at Windsor, but she had never encountered a direct refusal to follow the constitutional requirements of a royal birth. One of the most damning revelations in this portion of Sophie's broadcast involves the logistical sabotage of the Queen's schedule. The Duchess reveals that the timing of the baptism was shifted multiple times in a manner that seemed designed to make it impossible for the Queen and the Prince of Wales to attend. This created a global public perception of family coldness, a narrative that the senior royals were snubbing the newborn when in reality, the Sussexes had created a schedule that ignored the sovereign's long-standing state commitments. Sophie confirms that Catherine was particularly devastated by this period. The Princess of Wales saw the traditions she had spent a decade mastering being treated as disposable inconveniences. In a private conversation during the week of the baptism, Catherine expressed a chilling fear to Sophie that the very foundations of the monarchy were being eroded from within by an insurgent force. It was during this specific window in 2019 that the palace shifted its strategy from engagement to documentation. Sophie reveals for the first time that a formal internal ledger was established. This was not a diary of grievances, but a clinical administrative record. Every breach of protocol, every instance of staff mistreatment, and every strategic probe was recorded, reviewed by legal counsel, and filed within the sovereign's archives. This ledger was the true origin of the now infamous bullying investigation. While the Sussex camp has consistently characterized these allegations as a smear campaign launched just before the Oprah interview in 2021, Sophie's testimony provides a far more methodical perspective. She describes a toxic environment where long-serving, loyal staff members were subjected to what she calls emotional attrition. The goal, according to Sophie, was to replace the existing palace guard, those loyal to the crown, with a team that was loyal only to the Sussex brand. When the HR department was finally activated, it was not a sudden reaction to a news story. It was the culmination of 3 years of methodical data collection. Sophie makes a critical distinction that serves as the hook for understanding the palace's current hardline stance in 2026. She explains the difference between a private grievance and an institutional record. By the time Harry and Meghan departed for Canada and eventually California, the palace had already administrativized the conflict. Every event, the 72-hour probe at Sandringham, the Royal Foundation sabotage, and the baptism veto had been converted into a don juarque. This is why the Crown remained so hauntingly silent during the Netflix and Oprah years. They weren't being passive, they were being evidentiary. They were waiting for the moment when the truth could be deployed with maximum institutional impact. Sophie recounts a final, poignant attempt to reach Meghan during the transition period of early 2020. She had hoped to offer a pathway for a graceful exit that would preserve the family's dignity. But Meghan's response was a chilling repetition of her earlier mantra. I have Harry, that's all. For Sophie, this was the final confirmation that the Duke of Sussex was no longer a principal actor in his own life. He had become the instrument through which the institution was being provoked. The Duchess of Edinburgh's testimony clarifies that the era of trying to save Harry ended in the spring of 2020. The era of protecting the throne from him had begun. The silence of the palace was the silence of an institution that had already moved on to its next phase, the cultivation of the Wessex vanguard. As we move into Part 5, we will see how this clinical documentation led to the ultimate rejection during the 2026 American state visit. We will analyze the no-exception itinerary and how the king utilized the very ledger Sophie describes to turn his own son into a diplomatic variable to be managed by security experts. The door to the family may remain ajar, but as Sophie concludes, the door to the working monarchy has been welded shut by the weight of the facts. Stay with us, because the financial and social collapse of the Montecito illusion is about to be laid bare. As we move into the 5th chapter of this historic analysis, we must address the cold, economic reality that led to the collapse of the Montecito narrative. If the previous years were about emotional conflict, the period between 2023 and 2025 was defined by what Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, calls the Great Attrition. This was the era where the Sussex brand hit the immovable object of institutional indifference. While Harry and Meghan spent years building a digital empire based on the monetization of grievance, the palace was quietly executing a strategy to render that grievance irrelevant. Sophie's 2026 testimony provides a devastating autopsy of a failing brand, She reveals that the palace monitored the declining metrics of the Archewell Foundation and the termination of their major media contracts with a sense of clinical inevitability. The Duchess notes a fundamental law of the attention economy that the Sussexes failed to grasp. When a brand is built entirely on the disclosure of family secrets, it possesses a built-in expiration date. Once the secrets are told, the value vanishes. In contrast, the value of the crown is found in its permanence and its silence. The data Sophie presents is staggering. She points to the financial disclosures of 2024, which showed a 59% drop in donations to the Sussexes' charitable endeavors. This was the exact moment, according to Sophie, that the global elite, the billionaires, the tech moguls, and the political power brokers realized that the Duke and Duchess were no longer the gatekeepers to the British monarchy. They had become private citizens with expensive tastes and diminishing influence. They were no longer royal, they were merely celebrity, and in the hierarchy of power, that is a significant demotion. But the true masterpiece of the palace's strategy was unveiled during the American state visit in April 2026. As King Charles III and the Prince of Wales prepared to touch down on American soil, the world expected a media circus. We expected desperate attempts at reconciliation, or at the very least, a series of high-profile counter-programming events from the Sussex camp. Instead, the world witnessed the power of the no-exception itinerary. Sophie reveals that this was a formal administrative document signed by the king months before the tour began. It was not a personal snub, it was a state-level security directive. The memorandum ensured that every second of the king's energy was directed solely toward the special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. It effectively created a diplomatic vacuum around the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The most chilling aspect of Sophie's account is her description of the Risk Control Board. She explains that by 2026, Harry was no longer treated as a son to be negotiated with, he was treated as a security and diplomatic variable. Every request for a meeting, every quiet panic phone call from the Sussex camp as the royal plane landed in New York, and every attempt at a symbolic gesture of reconciliation was processed by a committee of civil servants and security experts. None of it ever reached the sovereign's desk. Sophie describes this as the ultimate form of royal rejection. It is the transition of a family relationship into a purely administrative matter. When Harry reached out to his father during that week in April, he wasn't met with anger or a dial tone. He was met with a polite, standardized response from an office of risk management. The king had administrativized his own son. This brings us to the fear of missing out that gripped the Sussexes during the 2026 tour. Sophie recounts the atmosphere within the royal party as they moved through New York and Washington. While Harry remained just a few flight hours away in California, he was functionally invisible to the proceedings. The crown was proving that it could operate with total authority on Sussex turf without acknowledging their existence. The Duchess of Edinburgh notes that the palace utilized this silence as a weapon of mass exhaustion. By refusing to engage with the drama, they stripped the Sussexes of their oxygen. Without the conflict with the crown, the Montecito brand had no engine. Sophie reveals that the king's strategy was simple: treat the Sussexes as if they were already part of the distant past. As the state visit reached its climax, the palace didn't just ignore the vacancy left by Harry, they filled it. This leads us to the most significant institutional correction of the last 10 years, the rise of the Wessex Vanguard. While the world was looking for Harry at Arlington National Cemetery, they found a young man named James Alexander, the Earl of Wessex, standing at the king's side. Sophie explains that the cultivation of her son, James, and her daughter, Louise, was a long-term plan initiated by the late Queen and perfected by King Charles. They were the antidote to the Sussex volatility. James performed the duties of the warrior prince with a stoic dignity that reminded the world of the late Prince Philip. He did not seek the camera, he served the sovereign. Sophie concludes this chapter of her testimony with a profound observation on the nature of power in 2026. She states that the Montecito illusion, the belief that celebrity could override the Constitution, has finally hit the wall of reality. The British public and the American establishment have responded with overwhelming approval to this new, disciplined generation of royals. Recent polls show that the Wessex duo now commands a level of respect that exceeds the Sussexes even at their peak in 2018. The battle lines are no longer drawn in the sand. They are etched in the archives of the state. The king's no-exception itinerary was the final lock on the door. As we move into the final part of this breakdown, we will see how the Wessex reality has replaced the Sussex fantasy, and why Sophie believes the House of Windsor has never been more secure. The era of the insurgent is over. The era of the vanguard has begun. Stay with us for the final, devastating conclusion to this 5,500-word journey into the heart of the modern monarchy. The clinical conclusion of Sophie's broadcast and the 2026 state visit to the United States serves as the definitive closing of the Sussex chapter in British history. This final phase is characterized by what constitutional scholars are now calling the loud silence, a strategic, multi-layered refusal to grant the Duke and Duchess of Sussex the recognition they require to sustain their commercial and social relevance. As King Charles III and the Prince of Wales conclude their engagements in New York on this 1st of May, the message to the international community is absolute. The British monarchy has moved beyond the era of crisis management and into an era of permanent restructuring. The institution has proven that it does not need to engage in a shouting match to win. It simply needs to exist with a level of consistency that renders its detractors redundant. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, concludes her testimony by addressing the concept of institutional resilience. She explains that the crown has survived for over 1,000 years not because it is rigid, but because it is patient. It has watched as the Sussexes utilized every available media platform, from streaming giants to global talk shows, to challenge its legitimacy. The palace responded by simply continuing to perform its constitutional duties. The Duchess notes that the greatest failure of the Montecito strategy was the assumption that the public's hunger for drama would eventually force the king to capitulate. Instead, the drama exhausted the audience, while the crown's silence offered a sense of stability that the public eventually found more valuable. By May 2026, the data is undeniable. The institution is stronger, the new vanguard is in place, and the former occupants of the spare role have been relegated to the periphery of global interest. The final administrative act of this tour was the enforcement of the no-exception itinerary. Sophie reveals that despite the quiet panic emanating from the Sussex camp in the final days of the visit, the king remained entirely insulated from the noise. Every request for a meeting, every suggestion of a secret summit, and every attempt at a symbolic gesture of reconciliation was processed and declined by the Risk Control Board without ever reaching the sovereign's desk. This is the ultimate form of royal rejection, the transition of a family relationship into a purely administrative matter. Harry is no longer a protagonist in the royal story. He is a file to be managed by civil servants in the interest of state stability. Sophie's parting words in her broadcast focus on the emergence of James Alexander and the permanence of the Wessex era. She describes her son not as a replacement for Harry, but as a correction of the role. James has demonstrated that a member of the royal family can be young, modern, and engaging without sacrificing the dignity of the office. His presence at the side of the Prince of Wales throughout the tour has provided the world with a vision of the monarchy's future, a future defined by unity, discipline, and a profound respect for the unwritten rules of the house. The Earl of Wessex has successfully reclaimed the warrior prince narrative, performing his duties at Arlington National Cemetery with a stoicism that has earned the respect of the American establishment. The vacancy has not just been filled, it has been upgraded. The Duchess further elaborates on the role of Lady Louise Windsor, who has emerged as the intellectual anchor for this new generation. Together with James, they form a unified front that offers the Prince of Wales a level of reliability that Harry never provided. Sophie confirms that this Wessex dynamic was not an accident, but a long-term plan initiated by the King and the Prince of Wales to ensure that the institution would never again be vulnerable to the whims of a single disgruntled family member. Recent polls show that the British public has responded with overwhelming approval, with the Wessex duo now commanding a level of respect that far exceeds the Sussexes even at their peak in 2018. As the royal party prepares to depart from American soil, the shift in the global hierarchy is clear. The Sussexes, who once commanded the attention of the world's most powerful people, now find themselves isolated in a celebrity ecosystem that is increasingly indifferent to their grievances. Their strategy of using royal proximity to build a private empire has hit the wall of the palace's indifference. Without the oxygen of conflict with the crown, the Sussex brand has no engine. Sophie makes it clear that the palace will not be providing any more oxygen. The era of the Sussex insurgency is over, replaced by a Wessex era that has restored the moral and structural consistency of the British monarchy. The 2026 tour will be remembered as the moment the crown regained total control of its narrative. By allowing Sophie to speak and then officially confirming her words, the palace has delivered a final, documented verdict on the Meghan Markle era. The image of the victimized outsider has been replaced by the reality of the calculated strategist whose campaign failed to penetrate the resilience of the institution. The silence of the crown remains its most powerful weapon, and in the aftermath of Sophie's broadcast, That silence is deafening. The human cost of this strategic victory is not ignored. Sophie speaks of Harry as a man who allowed his personal pain to be weaponized against the very institution that gave him his identity. She describes the tragedy of a prince who traded a seat at the table of history for a role in a declining celebrity ecosystem. The Duchess of Edinburgh makes it clear that while the door may never be fully closed on a family level in the private, quiet moments of a father's heart, the door to the working monarchy is welded shut. The Wessex vanguard has taken the field, and they are playing a different game, one defined by loyalty to the future rather than a fixation on the past. The House of Windsor is moving forward, anchored by the loyalty of William, Catherine, and the rising Wessex generation. The Montecito chapter is closed, the locks have been changed, and the monarchy has never looked more sovereign. Sophie's broadcast was not just a speech, it was the final period at the end of a long, tumultuous sentence. As the sun sets on this 1st of May, 2026, the world realizes that the never-explained doctrine was only broken once, and it was broken to ensure that the explanation would never need to be repeated. The Montecito illusion has been replaced by the Wessex reality, and the crown has never looked more secure in its choice. The future has arrived, and it no longer includes the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. This is the end of the line, and the silence that follows is the sound of an institution that has already moved on to the next 100 years.